All right, Dave, you wanna?
Okay. Thank you very much. So today's agenda, we will walk through just a few slides. First, we'll talk about the sandbox problem. So just to kind of scene set, then how Data Parrot helps solve the sandbox problem. We'll give an overview of the architecture and then dive right into the demonstration, and then talk about some benefits and then finish with a little bit of Q&A. So I think everybody should be familiar with the sandbox problem. Every organization has stale and unused sandboxes, whether they be developer, developer pro, or partial. They contain all the metadata, but very little relevant customer data. Manually loading data is tedious and time consuming. Obfuscating that data for manual load is tedious and oftentimes error prone. That lack of quality tends to introduce repetitive inefficiencies and sprint cycles, and ultimately incomplete data can skew test results and increase your deployment risk. Data Parrot, the way we solve this, so Data Parrot enables admins, QA users, business users to copy complete sets of related data from any source to any target within the customer organization. It auto-discovers all available sandbox in that organization and enables you to easily connect, point and click. Once you're connected, you can view the real-time limits for that organization, such as APIs and storage available, which is very important when you're moving sets of data around. You can set the data set object scope. It gives you a lot of flexibility and a lot of levers in how you define your data set. You can mask fields that contain sensitive information. Using the query builder is very easy. It's a point and click to build your starting base query. And then on dataset copy, you can disable triggers, workflows, flows, and validation rules.
All right, I'll go ahead and talk about the architecture a little bit. It is an ISV managed package. It comes from the App Exchange. The front end is all Salesforce native. It's built on Lightning components, and you install it and run it in your production organization. The back end is all running on AWS. We use a handful of services on AWS. Excuse me, we use the Elastic Compute Cloud instances. We use Simple Storage Service to store logs, files. We do metadata deployments, so we use that storage. We use a queue service to manage queues, workers. And we use simple email service to send out transactional notifications. The data is all stored in Postgres. We store basically everything that we consume about the organization schema. So the first thing we do when we connect to an org is do a describe schema, and then we do a describe object on everything we find, and then process that data in order to build out the hierarchy to understand the relationships between the different objects, how we need to create records with dependencies. We also store identity data, which is just about the users, their roles, their permissions, that kind of stuff. Operational data is what you define in terms of data sets and logs. We use OAuth to connect, and we do basically ask for a session token and a refresh token. So once you do connect, you're not going to have to reconnect over and over and over again as the days go on. We do encrypt that at rest in the database, and we also store application.
So now I want to create a new file, and you can name it whatever you want, but I'm going to go with nav.
I'm not confused. I don't know who that is.
Oh, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened.
Okay, that's fine. We'll move on. We're going to jump right into the demo, and I really appreciate all you guys being with us tonight. I know it's dinner time, and you're probably on your own time, so we'll try to keep it quick. Just give a high level of how the application works and how you build data sets and move them to a different org. So the steps we're going to go through is show how you connect an organization, how you discover sandboxes, how you start your data set, which is just with an initial query, and what that means and how we pull in data. We've got a couple of configuration options. One is the scope that says how many objects do we want to include or how many do we want to exclude. We've got some field masking options in order to obfuscate data as you copy it down into lower environments. We'll show a copy to an organization, and then we'll be able to look at the results to see how the data was copied in the same format and the relationships were preserved and masking happened when it needed to. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the demo here. This is Data Parrot. We're installed in a production organization. We have connected production, and you can see that Data Parrot went out and said, give me a list of all the available sandboxes. In our case, we have 5 sandboxes, a couple of devs, a QA, and a train. We've connected 2 of the devs, and because we've connected those environments, we have a certain amount of information about them. For each environment, we know who we connected as, what user we connected as, what the my URL is, the org ID, and we also keep track of when we originally connected to this instance and how many times we've refreshed the token. We have visibility into limits information. So as we're moving data around, the 2 things we're using is API and storage. So we want to be cognizant of those limits and how much space is available, how much API is available within our 24-hour threshold, so that as we process these operations, we know that we're within limits. Every time we connect to an organization, there's a job that starts in the background that consumes the metadata for that org and gets limits information. So let's show you real quick how you connect. These top 3 environments are connected. This is my dev3 environment. My only option here, because I haven't connected to it yet, is to go ahead and connect. This is the standard OAuth flow. We're asking for a couple of permissions. Basic information, this is the identity data. Access and manage your data. We need read all data in order to use some of the APIs that we're using. And we need to be able to read every column in the data in order to copy it. And then the perform request on your behalf at any time is we're asking for a session token now and a refresh token so that we don't have to keep logging in. So we'll go ahead and do the allow. We're going to come back to Data Parrot and Salesforce. You can see that environment. That org is now connected. We've got up-to-date limits information as of just 5:34 p.m. So you can see this is an empty sandbox. We have almost no usage on space and API. In the background, we started a job, and you can see this is running. This is our metadata refresh. It's for the Dev3 organization. This is going to take about a minute, and this is what consumes all of the schema information. If that job's finished, let's go ahead and look at how you create a data set. And so for Data Parrot, the way we think about it is we start with an initial query. We start with a handful of records, 10, 20, 50 records. And then we move up and down the hierarchy of relationships to pull in related data. So the point of Data Parrot is not to put a couple of million records from one environment to another, from one org to another. We're looking at a focused set of data that a developer or a QA or any user needs to train on their job, to develop a new enhancement, to QA a new enhancement. So the way we start that is we've got this query builder. First, we have to determine our source org. In this case, we're going to go from production. The list of orgs here is the list of orgs that we've connected on that first tab. So we're going to choose production. We're going to go next. We're going to give this just a test, or well, we'll do open cases. There's not a lot of data in this org because it's a partner dev org. We'll talk about these limits after we look at the query for a minute. So in order to start, we got to pick our base object. This is a curated list of standard objects plus all of the custom objects on the system. You can see we've got a handful of managed packages installed here. We're going to choose case, and now this is metadata driven. We've got our query builder. We can start building some criteria. So I'm going to say where the status is not equal to closed, and I can do validate. And in the background, what this does, we're not going to use scope. We'll talk about that in a little bit. In the background, this has created a valid SOQL that you can cut and paste into another application like Workbench, but it has run the query against the source org, and we have an idea of exactly how many rows we're going to start with. We can use the criteria, the rule builder, to focus down on a smaller set of data. And the reason is, if we start with a really big set of data and then start traversing all those relationships up and down the tree, the hierarchy, then we pull in a huge amount of data. So generally, we want to start with what is the main thing I'm interested in? Am I interested in accounts or leads or opportunities or cases in the last week? In this case, we're going to do open cases. I can add a couple of more rules. I can say where the created date was less than or equal to March 1st. Actually, let's see, I just built this today. So I'm going to do March 10th. You can see now we've still got 7 cases because we don't have a lot of data here, but this is how we narrow down. We can also do groups. So I can add a group and a couple of rules, and I can make this an or condition, and I can say where the priority is equal to high, or the priority is equal to medium, or priority is equal to low. This doesn't make a lot of sense as in terms of an operational query, but this just shows you how it works. So again, we've got validated SOQL that we can cut and paste into another application. And there's a lot of flexibility because it's metadata driven to drive down right to the query that you want. Once we've got this done, we go ahead and hit create. There's a couple of levers we want to look at before we create the data set. This first one is a hard data set record limit. As we move up and down the tree, as we're pulling in related data, when we hit this number of records, we're just going to shut down. And that allows you to basically keep it very focused. If I'm really only interested in 100 or 5,000 records, we can go there. If we wanted to let it run to 50,000 records, we can do that. The base object record limit, this is a hard limit on our initial query. And you can see where this is in our query down here. We've got a limit 200. So let's say our query pulled 1,000 cases. With this limit, we're going to limit it down to 200 again, just to keep us in that small initial query as we build out. The relationship record limit says when we find a relationship, how many records do we want to get off of that relationship? So let's say we're pulling accounts and there's a contacts relationship. We may have 50 or 100 contacts, but we really only need 5 or 10 for the development enhancement we're working on or for the QA we're working on. Again, the goal here is just to kind of trim up the data set that we copy. The scope is something we'll look at. This is a configuration option we'll look at after we look at the data set, and dependencies also is just another way to limit the size of the data set. We go ahead and hit create. This starts a job in the background. We can see over here, that's processing. We're doing open cases. We're running on production. So while that's running, let's take a look at the configuration options. So scope is a way to say, only include data from a list of objects or include data from all objects except for the ones on this list. And we've got a couple of little fun things to help you do that. Let's say I'm doing an enhancement, I'm working on standard objects. I may have TaskRay or some other very big ISV package that's installed. It's hooked into the records that I'm looking at, but I'm not really concerned with that data. So what I want to do is build a data set that includes everything except the managed package objects for TaskRay or for anyone, Conga, any others. So we can change this to an exclude scope. We are either include or exclude. And then here we're aware of the packages that are installed in the system and the options and the objects that are in those packages. So here's the magic mover for notes and attachments package. It's got 4 objects. I can pull all 4 of those in, and now that's in my exclude list. I can remove them all and go back to 0. I can add in just a handful of my packages, or I can grab all of the managed package objects on the system and set this up as an exclude. And this is actually really common. We can look at the details here. So here are my 3 packages, managed packages. Here's the objects that are in them. And when I use this as a scope, when I create a data set, it says include all of records from all of the objects except for the ones on this list. We can also do an include, which is just the opposite. And we can look at this one. I've created an include that is just account, contact, and opportunity. So that means if we started with account, we're going to pull in contact and opportunity, but we're not going to pull in contracts or other relationships that are not listed in this list. So that gives you kind of a good idea of scope. One of the things that I think is the most interesting is field masking. A lot of times we have sensitive data in production. When we copy it down to a development org, we may have people working in that org that need to have administrator or very high access level rights to the schema, but we don't want them to see the data. In that case, we want to obfuscate the data as it's being copied into the org. This is really common. Let's look at this, how we do this. We're going to just call this test. We can add these one by one. So let's say, again, this is the same list as before. It's standard objects and all the custom objects. Let's say we've got a pick list field like account type, and here's our values from our source org. And what this does, we're going to say, let's make them all customer. So every time we copy an account and there's an account type in the source, it doesn't matter what it is, we're going to replace that with customer as it goes into the target. There's a handful of examples that might be a little more worthwhile. One of the things that happens a lot when you copy data into a sandbox environment, you end up with live email addresses. And if you don't go through with scripts to somehow modify those addresses so they can't be sent out, if you don't do that, you have to turn off email for that whole environment, which may affect your testing that your developer or your QA is doing. So because we have the metadata, we can say, why don't we grab all email fields in the schema? So we click this button, and this is going to pull in every object, whether it's standard or custom, and it invalidates. The default option here is to invalidate the email in the same way that the user table is invalidated when it is copied to a sandbox. So where my name might be mike@dataparrot.io, when it's copied to a sandbox, it would have .invalid at the end of it so that we don't get any email. Let's say I'm working on contact, I'm working on an enhancement around contact, I'm working on some flows, and I want to be able to have that email be active and have all of those emails come to me, no matter who the contact is in the system. I can uncheck invalidate, and I can just put in my own address. And now, every time an email contact is copied to a source environment, to the target environment, it's replaced with my email. We've got a couple of, one more option for encryption fields. This is for classic encryption, where there's masking that's done on the screen, and this is for the classic encryption, not shield. For social security number, national insurance number, there's a handful, a credit card number, just mask all last four. So again, because we have the metadata, we can go search the schema and find these fields. And here's an example. This is my custom object that I've got from my Dreamhouse app, which is what we use to demo. I've added some custom fields, one for each of the 6 types of encryption. And this is how the mask looks. So what this means is when a credit card number in the broker object is copied to a target, the live number will be read from source. And this value is what will get put in the actual table in the target. So it'll be 4x's dash 4x's dash 4x's, and then the last 4 of the original data, just like the masking would be in the application. And so that allows you to copy that sensitive data down into a target environment and not worry about who may be able to see that. So that is one of the things that you apply when you copy the data. So let's go look at how we do that. We're going to go back to the data sets. So you can see, here's our data sets. This is the one that I just built. We have a handful of ways to describe it. We have a record count. We have an estimated space that's going to take, status on it, and we've got some details. So let's go look at my bigger data set here. Here are all the options that I chose when I built the data set. Here's my initial query. And you can see here are the details of the records that were included in this. We've got 2 objects that are custom, 7 standard. We've got a summary of the breakdown of records. We can drill a little bit deeper and see how many records we have in each object. And we can go one level deeper and see what the name field is for each of those. So what we're storing is not the entire record. We're just storing the ID in the name field. The reason this is important is if I built this data set 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I've got a developer who said, I need some data and I really need to work with the Acme account. I know that's got data in it that will affect me in my testing. So I can go back to my data set definitions and quickly see, yep, the Acme account is here. We can expand all of this to see all of the details of every object that's in here. We've got one more option to download it as a spreadsheet. And so this comes down with a lot of detail. There's a cover page. Let me move this onto my screen here. We've got a cover page with a summary of when the job was run, our objects and counts. We've got one sheet with all of the objects, the name fields, and all of the IDs. This is from the source environment. And then we've broken it out by object as well. So you can see as you're copying data, if you need to know exactly what data went across, for whether scripting or more manipulations, it's very easy to get to. So now let's go look at the actual copying a data set to an org. We'll show how that works, and then we'll go look at some live data on a job that I ran earlier today. So in order to copy, we go to copy to org, we pick our data set. We've got a pull down list. These are going to be the orgs that we've connected on the first tab that are not where we built the data set. So in this case, we built it in production. We're not going to copy it to production, but we can choose our dev1 environment. Now we've got a handful of information, a little bit of information about the data set that we're going to copy, the number of records, the size. We've got a summary of the available API requests on the source, the available API and storage on the target. This is all kind of visual cues for us to know, are we going to be able to get this data set in? In this case, it's a pretty small data set and it's a brand new sandbox, so no worries. We've also got options to inactivate triggers, validation rules, and workflows, also flows. And what this does is a lot of times these have been fired in production, And if they fire again downstream, they may create duplicate records. They may call validation that fails the second time around. So many times when you're inserting data into a new environment, live from production, that you want to turn all these off. We also have the option to rebuild data set from source. Let's say I defined this data set, open cases, about 3 weeks ago, a month ago. I can rebuild it again today. And basically it just redoes the build process to pull in any new data that has been created since I ran it originally 3 weeks ago. Then the last thing we have is our field masking option. We can either don't mask fields, which means copy all the data exactly as it exists in production down to dev 1, or we can use the masks that we've defined, and this list would expand as we had more options for masks. So now I've run this copy earlier. Let's take a quick look. Here is my production org. I've got a handful of accounts. Let's start looking at contacts first. So you can see I've got 6 or 7, 8 accounts with contacts. I've got reporting relationships. We've got phone numbers and emails. And what we want to see when we copy that to the source is that all these relationships are maintained, but the masking that we've asked for has happened. So let's go look in the sandbox. We're going to go to contacts. And when this loads, there we go. You can see our emails have all been invalidated. The phone numbers have been randomized. The names have been randomized. And one interesting thing about this, we can look at this real quick and say, you know what? I did the randomization on the name because I didn't want that to be exposed in my development environment, but I forgot to actually mask the email because now it's pretty clear this is Zach McDougall, right? So now we could go back and add that email, make it all go to Mike at Data Parrot, run the copy again, and it will update all the data that it copied across the first time, but it's going to wipe out all those emails and mask them with a single email. Another thing we can do, we can go look at the cases. So here's our cases in production. I'm going to look at our widget assembly case just because I know there's a comment and some tasks on it. We've got case comments here. One of the things we asked for was randomization of case comments. So we can go to our sandbox environment. We'll look at the same case and go down here, and you can see the comments have been masked as well, randomized. There's a couple other things. One of the things that's really important is the structure and the relationships. We want to make sure that, as if, here we have system solutions of Sacramento and California. If I go in here and I look at the hierarchy, I want to make sure that this hierarchy that exists in production was preserved as we copied it to a sandbox. So I'm going to go look at those two. I'm going to go here. I'm going to look at the hierarchy, and sure enough, that was preserved. Another good example of that is on the contacts. We've got all these reporting relationships. John reports to Carol, and Carol reports to Jeff, and Jeff, so all 3 of these work for global media. We can go look at these. These names are going to be obfuscated, but you can see, let me sort by account name. Same thing. This one reports to the one that starts with a Y, and the one that Y reports to the one that starts with a T. You can see all of those relationships were preserved. And the important thing is that not only are we creating records in the right order based on the object hierarchy, but also dependencies within the objects. I think, and David, unless I've missed anything, that pretty much gets us I guess the only thing I did miss is looking at the job logs a little bit. Here's the copy data set that we did. This log kind of tracks all of the actions that happened while we did the copy. Very quickly, you can see we've authenticated against the 2 environments. We've consumed the metadata. Here's an email. Here's a list of the fields we're going to be masking. We sync some record profiles, record types, and profile visibilities. Here's where we're looking for triggers and workflows and validation rules. One thing that's important to note is we're not just turning off all triggers and all validation rules. We're only looking for rules, workflows, triggers, flows that are affected by the objects in the data set. So if our data set only includes 3 objects, we're only going to go look for triggers on those 3 objects. We're not going to turn off everything in the system. We do a deployment and we start copying records. So you can see we've started creating accounts and contacts. When we get all the way to the bottom, we've got kind of a nice little summary here that says, here is what we attempted. We had these objects. Here's how many successes we had. Here's how many failures. We have one more column that's a skip column. If an account fails, because of a validation rule or for whatever reason, there's probably a cascading effect that happens. There's probably cases, contacts, opportunities that are all also going to fail because that parent account isn't there. Data Parrot is aware of those relationships. And as soon as the account fails, it skips the cases, contacts, everything underneath, and all of that cascades down. The reason for that is to make it much easier to troubleshoot. If I've got a bunch of skipped records, those are not errors. Those are ones that we just knew we couldn't get in because there was probably one error at the top of the hierarchy that happened. So that's the summary of what happened. We do another deployment to bring the triggers and validation rules back online, and that's it. So hopefully, my goal as a developer was to make it easier and faster to develop new enhancements. And what I found whether I was a consultant or an employee, usually what happened is, hey, here's the enhancement and we're going to spin up a new sandbox for you and it's got no data in it. And so that was really frustrating to me to try to figure out what the data in production looked like, try to mock up data that was the same. 2 weeks later, we've got a release cycle. My sandbox is out of date. I don't want to refresh it because I went through this effort to put data in it. So the goal of Data Parrot was really to make it very easy to grab a group of related data, whether it's 50 records or 20,000 records, and easily move it into a sandbox to speed up your development cycles. So Vuk, thank you very, very much for the opportunity to present here. And if you have any questions for us, please let us know. And David, if I missed anything, let me know.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. This was great. This is definitely a very unique features and unique application that I've seen so far. So I just want to address a few questions and then maybe we'll spend like a few more minutes. Well, first of all, I think what's the easiest way for viewers to reach out to you or to test your application?
So the best way is to get a hold of me at mike@dataparrot.io. Data Parrot is on the App Exchange. We do have a free trial there, and definitely, I'll know when that happens. And if anybody has any questions or wants a kind of a more of a one-on-one walkthrough in their org, I'm happy to do that, or we can do set up demos. I know these user groups are really helpful because usually it's an admin that's probably overworked at an organization looking for help to solve problems. And so that's kind of the role that we want to help play. So if there's people that are interested, definitely contact me and we can do a demo for your company or for your developers, your admins, whoever you'd like.
Got it. So I think so that your kind of primary target is really going to be Salesforce admins.
Yeah, the primary target is admins. The application needs to run in production, and right now you need to be a system administrator. What's on the roadmap pretty quickly here is to move that to a permission-based thing. So we're not strictly looking. There are some high-level permissions that we need, but we want to move away from looking at a specific profile. The beneficiaries of this, from using the product standpoint, we're trying to lighten the workload on admins because we know that they're the ones who have the permissions in the orgs to do this kind of stuff. And developers come and say, hey, I need this, or QA comes and says, hey, I need this. We're trying to lighten the load on them. And we're also trying to make everyone else's job a little bit easier earlier in the process by having accurate live data from the beginning. So you don't end up with, hey, I went through this 2-week sprint, I built this enhancement and it works great. It works great against the demo data that I made up, upload just typing in. And when I move it up to my next environment, which is a partial or a full, we start doing some testing on it and it breaks because now we've got records with full column data.
Got it. One of the questions that came in before was related to I think I've actually seen a similar scenario in the past where if, for example, as a developer, if I'm working in a developer sandbox where I have a limit of, I don't know how much, it is like 100 megs or something like that.
200 megs, yeah. Developers, 200 megs, developer pros a gig.
So if I'm trying to actually, and there's multiple developers working in their own environment before they push their changes to some kind of, partial sandbox. So the question is really, so we need to allocate X amount of data. We don't really care what that, how how many records in general, but we just need to mimic to a certain extent the production org, please, with the data itself, the integrity, quality of data, etc. So how do we then determine how much data we can push based on this 200 megabyte? Is there a way for us to know if we just like grab like, we want to have a representation of every object, standard and custom objects in the developer org. So I think that's one of the common problems. Like, okay, so how much data can I actually push?
Right. And I think that
Is there a way to
answer
address
is-
it? Yeah.
I'm sorry, the answer is really based on the record size of the way Salesforce sees the record size is I think 0.02K for almost all standard and custom objects, and then there's a couple of objects that are over that. And so you end up with, or 2K, you end up with looking at building up the data set to get to what I would think is the optimal thing is a decent amount of records that allows you to do your job. And so you can look at it two ways. You can look and say, hey, I'm gonna put 100 megs of data in there. Or you can say, you know what, today I'm working on an enhancement that is specifically around account, or it's specifically around this group of custom objects that we've developed, and they're all related lists to account and opportunity. And so what you kind of want to do is start with your lowest level objects that you're really, really interested in. Those are the ones you know. And Data Parrot will naturally go up the tree and pull in the dependencies you need. So you can either start at the top and build this giant tree going down, or you can start at the bottom and focus in on the data that you really want and know that Data Parrot is going to pull in the dependent records above that, the parent records that are needed in order to fill out that data set.
Okay.
Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, definitely that helps. Another question was related to, is it possible, for example, to prevent, if we are migrating, or if we're basically replicating data from one environment into another, are we able to in any way to prevent duplicates? Or is there something that can trap those duplicate records?
So Data Parrot is aware of the target org that you're going to. And so if you're copying from production to a developer sandbox, it's going to assume that the data isn't there unless it put it there beforehand. So if the first time we run a data set, it's going to do all inserts. We run that same copy again, it's going to do all updates. And if there's any more data in the data set, it's going to create those records. And the same works for Developer Pro. When we move to full and partial, now we get into a situation where the global ID, the record ID, even though it's global unique, is actually duplicated from production to a partial and from production to a full. So although IDs are identical, and Data Parrot says, you know what, I know I'm copying from production to full, so my first attempt is going to be an update. I expect to find that record because on my last full refresh, I probably put it there. If we don't find it, then we do an insert. Then we say, okay, you know what? This full refresh was 3 weeks ago, and this record was created yesterday. It doesn't exist, so we're going to do the insert, and we're going to track that from here on out and be able to do updates to it. So we don't necessarily do any duplicate prevention, but we try to be really smart about what the source and the target is in order to make sure that we're doing inserts and updates. One thing that is critical is every time we create a record between two environments, if we create a record from production into Dev 1 or Dev 2, we maintain that cross-reference. We know that here's the ID in prod, here's the ID in Dev 2, and we maintain that until the Dev 2 environment goes away or until you tell us to delete it. And that's one thing I kind of forgot at the beginning. For me, one thing that's really important is I want to be able to, this is all data in the cloud, but I want to be able to have some control over it. So if you decide you're done with Data Parrot, you've done a test, or it's not satisfying your business needs, you can go to delete all info on the production org, and this is going to delete absolutely everything that we know about any of the orgs and any of the users. So any data that we may have collected at any point, all of this gets deleted and we go back to a pristine state, and it happens almost immediately. We try to make it really clear in this dialogue, hey, don't think you're just deleting your own data. If you've got other admins that are using this product, all theirs is going to go away too. But that was important to me to make sure that we gave users the possibility to basically have Data Parrot forget about my org.
Excellent. What are some of the more common use cases, or based on I guess your current customer base, like where do you see the biggest value that it brings to the customers and their orgs?
Yeah, I think the biggest, there's two main cases, and David, step in here. The two main cases are really when you're working on enhancements, having data to start at the beginning really speeds up the sprint cycle. If you can start on day one with data that you're addressing, and you've got absolutely a clean copy of production from last night. It took us an hour or less to put some data in there, and we can start developing. It really slows down. It speeds up the sprint cycle. The other thing I think is probably the most valuable is the data obfuscation, being able to mask values as you go into the targets. And so that enables orgs that have protected information, personally identifiable information, as they move it out to, let's say, whether it's partner orgs or it's just different people, partner organizations like consulting firms that have access to environment, or if it's just different levels of access within your organization. You want to allow them to still be able to use and test and train on the application, but not see that protected information. And I think those are the two main cases.
There's two other interesting use cases as well. One would be maintaining a training sandbox for, say, new employee onboarding. Could be a salesperson, could be HR, could be, however. So you spin up a sandbox and you've got a data set that you can run at a regular basis to refresh the environment, help get new employees up to speed on, opportunity management, case management. And then the other use case is around having a demo org actually, and helping to drive user adoption through spinning up a sandbox, having a same data set run. So you've got the same bed of data, and you maybe want to demo upcoming changes, maybe material changes in your org, to help drive adoption because they see the change with their data that they know well.
Very interesting. That's very interesting, actually. The also what you have mentioned about the partner orgs. Basically, there are a lot of consultants, system integrators that are in this group, and I think one of the common use cases potentially that I can see, and I was hoping maybe you can touch on it a little bit, how would you approach it, is that, in today's world, a lot of these consulting companies have offshore teams, which is obviously a problem for the client or their clients, for the fact that, they don't know who will be in which part of the world touching their data. So I see a huge potential and value having this tool, because you obviously want to replicate, while you're as a development team or an admin, you want to replicate that environment as much as possible, so you can actually build your functionality or features, whatever you're doing. So how would you approach that scenario? Like, for example, if we have a client org, they want to limit who has access to that org due to the sensitivity of the data that's in that org. But then at the same time, we have developers in different continents, and we can easily replicate the metadata. But how would you, what would be the steps here to take to bring the data to these orgs and make sure obviously you're not exposing any sensitive information?
Yeah, and I think this is kind of one of the main use cases where you've got you may have different development environments for different resources in different parts of the world, and then you would mask the data based on who that audience was, whether it was just offshore employees, or if it was consulting firms that were here in the US or consulting firms that were elsewhere in the world. You would just mask the data around who control the protected information with masking based on whoever your target audience is. So one of the interesting things about Data Parrot, we obviously know that SIs, this is a big tool that you could put in your toolkit as an SI. So we have an SI version, and it basically is the same version, only an SI installs it in their own production org, and they can use it internally, but they can also manage production orgs for their customers. And so we would have a customer agreement with them. And so an SI would come in here, and there's an additional column that shows up on the left that is, here's my customer 1, customer 2, customer 3. And so you can have your own admins, as long as they have administrative rights to the customer, which is very often the case. They can go into production, especially if you have a smaller customer or one that is either doesn't have the time or doesn't have the sophistication, you can actually go in and run it for them. You can connect to production from your own instance. You can build the data sets, and you can copy data sets from their production environment down to one of their sandboxes or multiple sandboxes. That's another use is, let's have some consistency. I've got 3 people working in 3 different dev sandboxes. I'm going to give them all the same test data so that when we move up to the next level, they've all had the same experience. But SIs, if there are SIs on the call, or if there's SIs that encounter this, please get in touch with us. It's really pretty slick the way you can put it in your own org and connect to all your different customers. You can't move data between customers, but you can move data for customers on behalf. And again, just like whether it's an internal project, as an SI, a lot of times, you're in there trying to get things done as quickly and effectively and as accurately as possible. We just very strongly believe that having data at the beginning really changes that whole cycle.
Yeah, and one of the use cases for SIs would be staging data for an ISV implementation as well. We found that to be very useful. If they're implementing a managed package on behalf of their customer and their customers' environments, being able to stage a partial sandbox as a part of training, change management, and configuration. That's another big use case for SIs.
Excellent. I see a couple more things here. One is the question about data localization. Basically, for example, if you have data in Japan and Egypt, how would you treat those scenarios?
So we're just doing record copies. We're using the API to read records from the source and copy them into the target. So there's no translation abilities, but if you've got an org that you've got customers with different languages, then it's going to handle all that. Okay.
Got it. And then see here, I guess something else, but it's no longer there. I believe there's no more questions that I see here. So I think at this point, maybe unless there's something else, Mike and Dave, you would like to add, we can probably conclude this webinar in the recording. And thanks everyone for attending. And we will post more information in the group where you can get more information about the App Exchange package itself, and then obviously reach out to Mike and Dave if you have any questions or need help with the implementation or installation of the package itself. I'm sorry, go ahead. You were going to say something.
No, I was just going to say, Vuk, thanks very much for the opportunity. I know it's special for us to be able to get in front of admins and try to say, hey, look, here's a tool that really might help you, and just really appreciate the opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for the time, everyone.
All right. Hey, thanks very much.
Bye.